In this episode, we move from the idea of collecting data inside a product to the idea of pulling data from the outside world, especially data that appears to be public. It sounds simple at first. If information is public, then anyone can take it. The reality is messy, because public does not always mean free of expectations, free of risk, or free of privacy impact. Public information can still be personal, it can still be sensitive in context, and it can still be used in ways that surprise the people it's about. When a system automatically gathers public data at scale, it can change the meaning of that data, turning scattered facts into a powerful profile. This episode is about learning how to extract public data in a way that is responsible, thoughtful, and defensible when someone asks the obvious question, why did you collect this, and what did you do with it? Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first beginner idea to lock in is that public data is a setting, not a permission slip. A person might post something on a public website because they want it seen by a community, because it supports a professional goal, or because they did not understand the settings. Public data can include posts, comments, images, reviews, business listings, court records, meeting agendas, property data, and many other sources, but the existence of a public web page does not erase privacy concerns. The risks depend on who the data is about, what the data reveals, and how the collection changes the audience and the consequences. Collecting one public post manually is different from collecting millions automatically and combining them with other sources. Responsible extraction begins with respecting that difference in scale and recognizing that scale can create new harms even when each single record looks harmless. A useful mental model is to ask what a reasonable person would expect when they publish something publicly. Many people understand that strangers might read their post, but they do not expect their post to be copied into a permanent database, analyzed, scored, and used to make decisions about them. They might not expect their information to be repackaged into a searchable directory that makes it easy to locate them, contact them, or harass them. They also might not expect their content to be tied to other identifiers, like linking a username to a real name, a location, and a workplace. Expectations are not a perfect legal test, but they are a strong privacy engineering guide because surprise is where trust breaks. If your collection plan would surprise a reasonable person, you need stronger justification, tighter limits, or a different design. You also need to distinguish between public by default and intentionally public. Some data is published specifically to be reused, like open data portals or public research datasets with clear reuse terms. Other data is public only because of how platforms work, like a social profile left open, a forum post, or a comment on a news site. The second category often carries more context and more implicit boundaries, even if it is technically accessible. Responsible extraction means you look for signals of intent and governance, such as licenses, terms of use, robots rules, and data access policies. It also means you consider whether the source itself warns users about reuse, and whether the source is known for being a place where people speak casually rather than formally. If you treat every public page as equally reusable, you will inevitably step into ethically weak territory. A defensible approach starts with purpose definition, because public extraction without a narrow purpose can quickly become data hoarding. Purpose definition should be concrete enough that a non-technical reviewer can understand it, and specific enough that it restricts what you collect. For example, gathering public vulnerability advisories to track security trends is different from gathering personal social content to infer behavior. A clear purpose also lets you decide what you do not need, which is just as important as deciding what you do need. When teams skip this step, they tend to collect broad categories just in case they become useful later, which turns public extraction into overreach by another name. Purpose is the anchor that keeps extraction from drifting into profiling and surveillance. Once purpose is clear, you can apply data minimization to extraction, which means you collect only the fields and only the records you actually need. If you need to know that a business exists and its hours of operation, You may not need names of individual employees or customer review text that mentions personal experiences. If you need a count of events, you might not need the full content of every post, and you might store only a reference or a summary that is less personal. Minimization also includes sampling, rate limiting, and not collecting rare edge cases that are high risk and low value. The temptation is to say the collector already sees the full page, so storing it is easy, but privacy engineering treats storage as a decision, not a side effect. If you cannot defend why a particular field is stored, the safest choice is not to store it. A major risk in public extraction is re-identification, which happens when you connect data points to figure out who someone is. Even if you never collect obvious identifiers like names, the combination of a location, an employer, a job title, and a set of posts can be enough to pinpoint a person. Re-identification risk grows when you link across sources, because each source contributes a few clues that become decisive together. The responsible pattern is to avoid building linkages unless they are essential to the purpose, and to avoid creating stable identifiers that make long-term tracking easy. If you do need to maintain continuity, you can often do so with short-lived or scoped identifiers that do not travel across unrelated datasets. A system that can quietly connect a person's public comments, purchases, and location history is far more invasive than a system that analyzes content in isolation. Another risk is sensitive inference, where you derive something about a person that they did not explicitly reveal, like health status, financial distress, or family situation. Public data can enable inference because people often share details casually, and automated analysis can detect patterns that humans would miss. Even if the original content is public, turning it into a risk score or a targeting segment can create significant harm. This is especially true for children, vulnerable individuals, and people in sensitive roles. Responsible extraction includes deciding in advance which inferences are out of bounds and designing the pipeline so it does not produce them. A good beginner rule is that if an inference could be used to discriminate, exploit, or endanger someone, you should treat it as high risk and require exceptional justification to proceed. You also have to think about correctness, because public data can be wrong, outdated, or misleading, and extraction can amplify those errors. A person might be misidentified, a record might be duplicated, or a listing might be out of date. If your system uses extracted data to make decisions, errors can become unfair outcomes, like false suspicion, denial of service, or reputational harm. Responsible extraction includes quality checks, source provenance, and a way to correct or remove records when they are inaccurate. It also includes cautious language internally so teams do not treat extracted public data as ground truth. A defensible posture is one where you can explain how you handle mistakes, not one where you assume the internet is always correct. Defensibility also depends on governance, which is a simple word for who is allowed to do what and under what rules. Extraction should not be a hidden side project that only a few people understand, because hidden projects tend to ignore boundaries. A responsible organization defines who approves new sources, who reviews purpose alignment, and who can access the collected dataset. Access should be limited, logged, and tied to roles, especially when the data is personal even if it is public. Governance also includes documenting the source, the collection method, the retention period, and the intended use cases. When someone asks why you collected public data, defensibility comes from being able to show that the decision was deliberate, reviewed, and constrained. Retention is another area where public extraction goes off the rails, because teams may treat public data as permanently reusable. Keeping extracted data indefinitely increases the chance it will be used for new purposes that were not originally justified, and it increases the harm if the dataset is breached. A responsible plan defines how long the data is needed for the stated purpose and deletes it when that time is over. If the purpose is trend analysis, you may retain aggregated metrics longer while deleting raw records quickly. If the purpose is matching current listings, you might refresh the dataset regularly and drop older snapshots that no longer serve a need. Retention limits are not just good ethics. They are also an engineering control that reduces risk without preventing legitimate uses. Another beginner-friendly but important topic is downstream use, which means what happens after extraction. Public data is often gathered for one reason and then quietly reused for another, especially when teams discover it is valuable. This is how a benign project turns into profiling without anyone making a dramatic decision. Responsible practice sets limits on secondary use and requires review when a new use is proposed. It also discourages the creation of broad shared datasets that anyone in the organization can explore for creative ideas. Creative exploration is fun, but it is not a strong justification for storing personal data, and it is rarely defensible when challenged. Defensibility improves when you treat public data as purpose-bound, not as an internal resource to mine endlessly. Respecting the source and the people behind the data includes being careful about collection methods, even if you are not thinking about legal rules. Aggressive collection can harm services by creating load, and it can trigger defensive behaviors that lead to conflict and distrust. It can also create a cat-and-mouse situation where teams start disguising collectors, which is a strong signal that the project has moved away from responsibility. Responsible extraction tends to be transparent and measured, and it avoids deceptive approaches that would not survive scrutiny. Even at a basic level, it is more defensible to use published access methods when they exist and to limit collection speed and scope. A project that depends on sneaking around barriers is hard to defend in a privacy engineering mindset. It is also worth recognizing that public data can become private again in a practical sense. People delete posts, change profiles, and update listings, and they do that because they want the world to see something different. If you capture and store public data, you can freeze an older version that the person tried to remove, which can feel like a violation even if the original was public. Responsible extraction considers whether it is appropriate to honor changes, removals, or updates, especially when the data is personal. In some cases, you can design the system to refresh and overwrite rather than to archive permanently. You can also avoid storing full content when a lighter representation would meet the purpose. A defensible approach is one where you can explain how you handle deletion and change, not one where you quietly preserve everything forever. When you bring these threads together, extracting public data responsibly is not about pretending public equals harmless, and it is not about avoiding all extraction. It is about building a practice that respects purpose, scale, context, and human expectations. You define a clear reason for collection, minimize what you store, and avoid linkages and inferences that turn public fragments into private surveillance. You build governance, restrict access, set retention limits, and design for correction and change. Most importantly, you plan for scrutiny by assuming that someone will ask how you made choices and whether the choices were fair. If you can answer those questions clearly, with boundaries and discipline, your public data extraction can be both useful and worthy of trust.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.